Hey, what's up, guys? Metal571 here today, and today we're going to be entering the Sennheiser zone. So this is the HD598CS, this is the HD558, and this is the HD600. So I originally wanted to do a review of the 598CS, and of course I found out one of my coworkers, I actually recommended it. He buy the 558. And he really likes it. But another thing that's important is a lot of people are looking at the 598CS and they're like, what's the difference between this and the open back, the 598, the regular 598, which is an open headphone. This is a closed headphone, the 598CS, hence the CS. And the 558 is very similar to the 598, actually. I've heard both. I've never actually heard them back to back, but they are very similar sounding headphones because some people think they use the same drivers, except that there's actually a piece of foam that's kind of blocking part of the vent here to the atmosphere, I want to say, the air on the 558 that's not there on the 598. So they're pretty similar. But the 558 and the 598CS are not necessarily related by driver. I believe this has a 569 driver in it, which is another new headphone from Sennheiser. At least I think. They updated recently. I think there's like a 599 now and whatnot. So there's been like a whole nother like refresh to the 558, 518, and 598 that came out recently. I haven't had a chance to hear any of those, but since the 598CS has seemingly been so popular, I figured I'd do a review on them. Anywho, moving on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the sound of each headphone, and I'm going to touch on how this 598CS compares to the 558 and the 600, and we'll go over that. So something I've been missing lately on my videos was, what are these intended for? So the 600, if you've seen my review on them, if not, make sure you click the link in the description and take a look at my review on these headphones. They're very important. Consider them one of the must-hear things for any audiophile who's looking at getting headphones. And in the case of these are a professional reference headphone. They sound very flat generally to most people, or they'll sound slightly dull to other people. It depends on who you ask. I really like them. They don't need a huge amount of EQ to sound amazing, in my opinion, but they're not perfect, and I think nothing really is, and that's why I use EQ in the first place. I'll talk a little bit more about equalization later. The 558 is kind of like a lower cost 600, but really doesn't actually have the same sound. It has the same kind of Sennheiser profile, the upfront mids, at least for me, the dropping off low sub bass, and relatively flat treble. Not necessarily so much with this headphone, but I'll get into that a little bit. But this is really like a consumer-oriented product, a little bit more consumer-oriented, and not quite as good build quality. Not that it's horrible, but you don't get that really solid feel from the strong metal headband here that's on the 600, but you also don't get the kitchen counter look, which is probably a plus in most people's books when we're talking about the 558, which is very similar again to the 598. This is the 598CS. It's a closed back headphone, also quite consumer oriented. The difference being the pads are actually the main difference with these, because it's a closed back. They have to isolate to some degree, so they don't have exactly the same velour pads. It's kind of like I think it's like a gel. It's almost like a gel, kind of like memory foam feeling thing, but not bad. And the headband here is also some kind of faux leather, I think. All right. So now that the build's out of the way, I should also mention that the 598CS, has a removable cable, just like the 558 does, but it also comes in the box with a short cable that has volume up-down adjustment on it. And so, obviously, targeting more of a portable audience as well. But interestingly, all these headphones, not all of them, the 558 and the 598CS are terminated by default in a 1/4 inch, except for the mobile cable for the 598CS, which is not terminated in a 1/4 inch, but the main one is. And that's funny because so is the 558, And neither of these headphones are really as, I mean, this kind of shows you that, it comes with this adapter, of course, on the 558s and the 598s, the regular ones, so that you can plug into something with a regular 3.5mm plug rather than the 1/4-inch plug. But it's funny that they include this, because usually the really high-end headphones have the 1/4-inch plug terminations, and those are the ones that are harder to drive, and these are not very hard to drive. I'll hopefully touch on that at the end as well. Alright, so let's get into the sound of these guys. They're all distinctly different, but they all kind of have that Sennheiser sound signature. So I'm going to have to make some notes, because this is kind of a complicated review. I'm going to go over the bass, mids, and treble like I usually do, but for each one I'm going to talk about each headphone within the bass, within the mids, within the treble. So, start with the 598 CS. So I thought the bass on these was actually pretty good, and the extension is quite improved over the 558 and 600. And obviously that's owing a great deal to the closed back design of these. Not surprisingly, it's not unusual to find that closed back headphones tend to have better extended bass. These I thought was really good. I actually thought that bass was relatively neutral, in fact. Some people think they sound kind of dark or bassy. I think they sound just about right. I didn't really have to add almost any bass at all to these guys, and they sounded, satisfying without going over the top by any means. So that's what the bass is like on those. The 558s actually has the weakest bass of all of these, because it drops off the earliest. Tends to, kind of like most headphones, most open headphones I should say, the bass tends to roll off quite a bit, and it rolls off faster on these than it does on the 600, which retains that extension a little better. But again, I can't really enjoy either of these headphones without some kind of bass boost, the 558 or the 600. So I have to add that, because open backs, I don't know, it just doesn't sound as satisfying without that. Mids, alright. There's quite a bit of difference, actually. All three headphones peak at about 3.5K, as they should. So the timbre is about right for the upper mids. But in the case of the 598 CS, it's got a little odd signature. The low mids, you've got this 300 hertz missing energy point, where you have a bit of a dip there, so it takes out of that, like male and female vocal lower ranges. So you miss some of that thickness and warmth to the mids in these, and not very warm mids, kind of a cooler mid-range sound. You also get a little bit of a nasally sound around 1K, so they sound a little closed. They sound a little bit closed, maybe slightly honky. And then these have the sharpest mids, actually, of these three. I have never been a fan of the Sennheiser mid-range as is, except maybe for the 650 and the 800s mids. Pretty smooth, but these guys have got some sharp mids. Not as bad as like the MDR 7506 that I talked about. I'm not sure any headphone will dethrone those as mid-range canon of the year, of the decade, something. But these, I have to pull down the mids quite a bit, and it's more of a narrow peak too. I find that if I pull down 3.5K by about 6 dB, but with a quality level of 3.0, which is very narrow, for those who don't use EQ very much, it sounds quite a bit better. I don't have to pull out a large, wider area of the upper mids, just a more localized, smaller peak. But yeah, definitely not the best headphone for metal, I would say, at least not without some equalization. Guitars really kind of screech on these, and if you play with EQ at all, you'll find that listening to them without my EQ, without that mid-range pulled out, is really piercing by comparison once you get used to listening to them with some EQ. Okay, 558. Now, these definitely have less of that 3.5K peak, but they're still quite aggressive. I still find them pretty aggressive, and quite a bit more upper mid-range still, by a couple dB, than the 600. But interestingly, these actually have a bit more, they're probably the warmest mids than any of these here. The 600's mids are a little more accurate. This one has a little bit extra energy in the low ranges of the voice, like around 300 hertz, something like that. And again, still the peak is pretty sharp, and I really am not a fan of these without some EQ pulling that 3.5K peak down. But still not quite as bad as the 598CS, faster headphone. And of course the 600, definitely the smoothest mids. I still think there's a little bit of a peak, but you guys know me, I'm like really picky about the upper mids. But thankfully I only have to pull these down, and you can see it on my EQ, by about 3 dB, so it's not that bad at all. With many genres, it'll be totally tolerable as is, right out of the box, the mids. And since these are kind of my reference, I don't like to nitpick in the low mids of these. I think they just sound about right. I don't think they're forward. I don't think anything is really standing out. It's very, very neutral in the mid-range. It's probably one of the most uncolored mid-ranges I've heard, period. Is this headphone. Except I still think there's just a little bit too much energy when it comes up to that upper mid-range peak that is expected, but I just prefer a little bit less. So there's the mids. Treble, 598CS. Actually, these headphones are not as bright up top as the 558s are, which surprised me because both of these headphones are actually have somewhat more forward mid treble around 10K. I thought the 558s may have a little bit of low treble peakiness going on too. They're pretty different than the 598CS. 598CS has relatively laid back treble compared to the 558. This is the big difference, I think. The 558 has clearly sharper upper mids and clearly more mid treble, making it sound a lot brighter, both in the upper mids and the treble, of course, than the 600. The 600, by comparison to all these, has a way smoother, way cleaner treble. And that's a big part of why people pay the top dollar for these. They have such a beautiful and wonderful sounding treble region that is like never harsh, except with the worst recordings. Which you could argue two ways. I mean, you could say that these don't reproduce faithfully and maybe smooth out the sound a little bit, hence why people use the term the Sennheiser veil. If you've heard that before, if you're part of this hobby, you've probably heard about that. And I guess you could say that, and I never really thought about it that much until lately, and I heard the 558s, I'm like, whoa, these have some much shinier treble than the 600s do. But it's also grainier, it's also not as detailed, and there's no problem with the treble extension. These headphones extend just fine, but they just don't have the resolution and the transparency and the liquid smooth mid-range and speed that the 600 has, and that's why people pay so much for the 600. Now, Soundstage, I think you'll be a little bit surprised by. I've heard this before. People have told me the 598 and 558, the open backs, have a wider soundstage than the 600 does, which sort of would be counterintuitive. Isn't the 600 a more expensive and better headphone? Actually, they're not lying. The 558 does have a wider soundstage, and I in fact think maybe possibly better imaging too, from what I heard, and it's actually quite a surprise. That is actually true. Now, I know I've heard the 598s and 558s before, but I've, of course, relentlessly defended everyone knows this is my favorite headphone right now, HD600. But it's true. These have a wider soundstage. It goes out with more width, further out sounding from your head to each side. And I think the imaging might be better. The 598CS is not a horrible headphone in terms of soundstage, but it's definitely more closed in compared to the 558. You would expect that. This is a closed headphone. The 558 is an open headphone. But the 598CS is not bad. It's no M50. It's definitely got some soundstage, and I enjoyed it, actually, with my EQ profile that I came up with. So, not bad for the price. And, of course, the HD600 once again revealed to me how clear it has a very much 3-blob type of soundstage. You have in front of you, and then you kind of have this blurry area to your sides, and then you have right beside you, and that's what the soundstage is kind of like on these, whereas the 558s have, for the left and right, it seems wider. Like, it sounds like the stereo field is just wider, has more width to it, and Also doesn't have quite as much of that blurry spot between the center image and the side images. So yeah, there's definitely some differences there in the Soundstage that don't get talked about a whole lot, so I'm glad I can shed some light on that in this review. So there you go, that's really what these three sound like. So overall, the 598CS is kind of like this M50-ish sound, if I had to compare it to any headphone. But okay, before you think, okay, I'm never buying this headphone, it's not bad. It actually cleans up alright with some corrective EQ. I don't think it's so lumpy sounding that it can't be fixed. And I like the bass, but of course I do. It's probably north of neutral for what some people would consider flat, but I think it sounds pretty flat. And you'll see that in the EQ profile. But again, this is probably a headphone I would never listen to without EQ, because those mids really bother me for whatever reason. But I just think that narrow peak, when a song hits hard in that one like mid-range area, like distorted guitar, man, it really is pretty sharp. 558's an aggressive open back sound of the 600 that's been tweaked in a bright direction with more upper mids and more mid treble, but a wider soundstage, which is pretty cool, and something that, again, I don't think people talk about too often. And then, of course, the HD600, you guys know how I feel about these. They will be my reference for quite a long time. I'm not even sure that if I get the HD800s, if I will let go of these guys, just because there's such a point of comparison that I always use in my reviews. So for equalization, and you guys, if I have never mentioned it before, I should. I use Equalizer APO and the Peace GUI plugin for it to create EQ for each one of these guys. And I'm going to post my profiles in the description like I usually do, but this time it'll be 3 of them, one for each one of these headphones. Then my recommended profile after doing listening through various genres, trying to make all those genres sound about how they should. So there you have it, 598CS. A closed back that could be portable, but you're going to want to watch those mids. This is kind of a headphone that I would buy if I had a return policy, and thankfully I do. I probably will be returning this to Amazon. The reason why I got one of these is because, 1, it's popular, and 2, it's been going on sale quite a bit for $100, and I think for $100, it's not bad at all. You could do a lot worse with $100. That falls into the range of the K553, the M40X, SRH 440, and so on, and the HD 380 when it's on sale. But I don't think I'd pay $150 for this, which I think is what it's going for normally. 100's pretty fair, but again, just be aware of the deviations from neutral that this guy's got. It's definitely not really as flat as the other Sennheisers we have here in this review. The 558 still gets my recommendation without question. It's a great open back headphone for an amazing value. The regular price of these where I am is $100, and that is spectacular. I cannot think of a better open headphone for $100 in that range, especially after you apply some EQ and they clean up super nicely. Just wonderful. Just a great intro if you don't want to drop the $260 to $300 that this guy tends to go for, the HD600. So there you have it. I hope this was interesting for you guys. A triple headphone review in one video. And again, as usual, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll try to reply when I get a chance. And happy listening.